Welcome to Act and Unwind, an ongoing conversation on a free and virtuous society. I'm your host, Eric Cohn. I want to thank you for listening, and I want to ask that if you're listening to us on our website, that you navigate right now to the show notes for this episode, where you're going to find a link to subscribe directly to Act and Unwind at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else where you listen to fine podcasts. And if you like this program, please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts so as to help more people find our show. Today, I'm joined by Dan Huger, Acton's librarian and a research associate. And this week, we're joined by a special guest, Sarah Isgur. Sarah is a senior editor of The Dispatch and host of the Advisory Opinions podcast and the Dispatch podcast, as well as an ABC News contributor. This week, we'll be discussing unintentional internet celebrity. But first, we want to start with the crisis in masculinity, also ? I wanted to discuss this because I had heard a conversation that Sarah had had with Jonah Goldberg on his podcast a couple weeks ago, after going through a lot of the Trump legal machinations and all that's going on there, got into this interesting conversation about what is going on with men. I think this was also on the heels of the report from the Surgeon General talking about a crisis of loneliness, which I think many of us, if it didn't specifically talk about loneliness being a problem with men, read it as being about a loneliness problem with particularly men more so than women. And I just thought that conversation was particularly interesting. We'll put a link to that podcast episode in the show notes as well, so people can check out what spurred this conversation. But Sarah, I wanted to start with you. I have so many different things I want to ask you that I kind of just want to say, just go. So in lieu of just asking, like, what is the issue with men right now, at least as you see it, you had some interesting thoughts, I thought, on friendship formation and as well as the way that interacts with marriage. And maybe that's a good place to start, that, men on one hand are having a more difficult time forming and keeping friendships. I think you'd brought up the idea of like the Elks Lodge or American Legion and things like that. It's not going to suffice for being the thing around which friendships are formed. And for a lot of those people too, you had the common bonds of having gone to war together. Even if you didn't serve in the same unit, you fought in the same war. And as the nature of the military has changed from World War II forward, the nature of those kinds of groups of men have changed in those kinds of clubs. But then also making the point that the kind of lack of friendship formation you're seeing outside of marriage, more men are kind of looking for everything and all things from their spouse. So maybe we start there and then we just see where we go.
Yeah, I mean, just for some table setting, I think I'm a pretty wackadoo feminist. And perhaps this conversation is interesting to me because I think feminism has to have a worthy adversary in some sense. And instead, I feel like the men are crumbling here, right? Women are 60% of the college grads. They're taking over, a lot more industries at the bottom. Now, you're still seeing this as a huge lagging indicator because, of course, if you're looking at CEOs or C-suite executives, it is still, of course, dominated by men. And, I have my things that I use to gauge how feminism is doing. The ambient temperature of offices is still far too cold, clearly dictated by men in charge. When I walk back to coach on an airplane and look at the first class passengers, they are still all men usually, or certainly not 50-50. So I think there are a lot of big reasons that we're seeing a crisis in masculinity. I think because the role that we need men to play in society has changed really dramatically, very quickly. You go back to, way back, men are literally protecting their families from lions, you needed, or other marauding tribes. They are physical protection for women and children. But even let's go to modern history here. The industrial age is all about physical strength. Even sort of factory widget stuff now we're about to see women sort of moving into that sphere, especially as World War I and World War II are going to take a lot of men out of the ability to do that work. And so now we're going to have women moving into the workforce. But of course, it's because the men were back to doing sort of the, physical saving stuff. And, we've known like brain chemistry wise and any number of other things, chess, serial killers, whatever it might be, that like men are always on the ends, the tails of the bell curve on both sides. And women are usually in the middle of the bell curve. Okay, so fast forward to now in this knowledge economy, all of those things where, yep, you have to kind of accept the men on the bad tail of the bell curve, but we get all the men on the front end of the bell curve. That front end of the bell curve stuff for these men is no longer nearly as valued. Instead, a lot of female attributes are valued in the knowledge economy. If you look at schools, sitting still, paying attention, listening to instructions, all things that I don't excel at. So again, we're going to have like all these generalizations about men and women, many of which not only do I know don't apply to all men and all women, they don't even apply to me. Like, so I was not particularly good at any of those things in school. But when you have schools predominated by female teachers, it's not then in a knowledge economy that sort of rewards things that women are going to be better at. It's not surprising then that you're going to end up with like a school environment that I think is less geared towards men. That's going to carry through why a lot of them aren't going to college, et cetera. And then, yeah, you get to marriage, and marriage used to be a economic contract, a business deal. You were forming basically your own corporation to raise children and create prosperity for them, to make it way oversimplistic. It was not, it was about affection. I mean, I'm not trying to buy into this notion of purely arranged marriages and stuff like that. Plenty of marriages were love marriages of a sort, but not the kind of love we talk about now. And so today, when you've stripped away a lot of the corporate form of marriage and the purpose of that, because women are working, supporting themselves, lots of single moms out there, doing fine. Marriage then becomes a lot more focused on the love part and the I can get everything from my spouse part. I think that actually can cut both ways. I don't think it's unique to the male side of the marriage, but women, I think, have a much easier time at any point in their lives saying like, oh, I'm not getting what I need from this relationship. I can now build all sorts of structures and moats and, things around me to fill some of those, what will become loneliness traps. And men are sort of left holding this marriage bag of, where they never used to get all of their, intellectual, emotional needs from their spouse. I think it's very tough now. And, you see that in even no-fault divorce trend lines, right? No-fault divorce was poo-pooed at the time, this idea that all these men would leave their wives for their secretaries. That's not what happened. It turns out all the wives are leaving the men because they suck. They don't need them. So, punchline, some of the crisis in masculinity to me is a need for the answer of why we need men. And I'm not sure that answer is very clear anymore, the way that it was 80 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, when it would have been obvious to anyone you asked that to. We literally don't even need you for your sperm. Like, we can just store that in a freezer.
So how do we begin to answer a question like that? I mean, we are seeing dramatic changes, not just in the economy and in the makeup of work life and all of that, and we're seeing kind of these really dramatic changes in expectations around gender roles and what men and women are supposed to do. So if it isn't going to be what these traditional gender roles have been for eons, how do we even begin to answer a question like that? I mean, it's not like we have a whole lot of experience there to rely back on, which is why, and I do want to get into this too, is like there are a lot of different reactions to all of this, but two of them that stick out in my mind, again, probably because my thank you, Elon Musk, the algorithm on X or Twitter or whatever we're calling it now is attuned to these, given the kind of work that we do at the Acton Institute. But I see these very kind of trad life promoters, both on the male and the female side. Emily Zanotti, who's contributing editor for us, kind of calls it like trad wife cosplay, as opposed to people who are actually kind of living that lifestyle, which I think Emily comes a lot closer to than a lot of the people who are doing it for show. But on the other side of it, you also have the Andrew Tates of the world, who are, it reminds me of, I cannot remember the first time I heard this said, but about the immigration issue, that if responsible politicians aren't going to deal with it, irresponsible people are going to show up and they're going to take over the issue. And it seems to me that that explains at least part of the Andrew Tate phenomenon, is that because there haven't been responsible people, and you can throw a lot of blame around on that, from accusations of toxic masculinity aimed at things that seem completely just anodyne and reasonable, because there hasn't been a reasonable attempt to deal with these questions, unreasonable people show up. And, given what we know about the makeup of men, there's an appeal there. There's a desire to say that you have a purpose, and this is what the purpose is. And it could be something really dark, and it could be something really awful. And there are plenty of examples throughout history of all of that. So what do you make of some of these reactions? And the basic first question I asked, how do we begin answering this if we don't really have a whole lot historically to rely on?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the how do we answer this when we don't have a lot historically to rely on could apply to so many things in our lives right now, like raising kids with social media. We're doing something our parents' generation never had to do. And in some ways, these last maybe 3 generations, especially of Americans, as parents, are in totally unique boats, because in the past, yeah, things changed over time, but they changed really slowly for the most part. 80, 90% of what you were doing looked the same as your parents. And now, as parents, like 0%, 10%, I mean, it's really low in terms of sort of the daily challenges you face.
As we are talking, I'm getting a text from my son who wants me to approve more time for him on Roblox, right? So it's like, it is entirely different universe.
Yeah. And you can't fall back on how you were raised in a lot of ways, which is part of the challenge. And so I think some of that applies here. A lot of it applies here as well, because I don't have a good answer to how you answer the question, what are men for right now? I'm a mother of boys, and I'm a big believer in men. But clearly we have a problem. And I love your explanation of if responsible people won't do it, irresponsible people will, because that's exactly what you're seeing with some of this, like, I don't even know what to call actual toxic masculinity of this idea that, like, there may not be a place for this in society anymore, but we will do it times a million the way we think that it used to be, based somewhere between video games and like fantasy books. And they'll need us then. That's not how it works. You don't sort of do a thing and then hope society comes to need that thing. And in the meantime, the problems get worse because of that, not better, because women then rely less and less on men for those things that they are no longer reliable for. And you certainly see that in the marriage numbers, in child rearing numbers. That's not good. When I say, like, what are men good for? I hope it goes without saying, like, I think they're pretty good for child rearing. I think it's pretty important, but they got to be there, and they have to have a purpose in the family. They can't just be there. And so the purpose problem is huge. Men need a purpose. Women, I think, and again, we're doing huge generalizations here, women find purpose very differently than men do. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on why that is from your perspective, that men's purpose seems like it's derived far more externally than women's purpose. I mean, you're a dad. Maybe you would say, no, my purpose is internal to the family unit, and that's where I derive my sense of purpose. But it feels like overall the, like, male brain like external purpose?
I mean, I think it's both. And I think for men, it's probably going to have to be a healthy combination of both, because at least there is that orientation towards kind of the world that we were describing, where with men as the breadwinners. My wife works as well, works outside of the home, to be clear, although she does work from home, so that gets all the more complicated to communicate. Family is part of it, but my career is a huge part of it as well. I don't think that I've particularly had. I don't feel, when I read these reports about men having problems forming friendships, that I don't see myself in that as much. So maybe in this case, like, I'm not a good person to kind of be detailing these problems, because I don't feel some of those same problems. But I definitely know of people out there who do identify with that. So I think we derive meaning from a whole bunch of different places, and to over focus on one element of it. If you're just obsessed with your career, then you're going to be a bad husband, you're going to be a bad father, you're going to be a bad friend. You have to figure out a way to balance all of these things. I think that's one of the tricks of life. And I don't know if we're perhaps just getting worse at figuring out how to balance these things. I wonder, going back to the social media point, and I do want to get Dan in here as well, and to the extent to which maybe we're just kind of overstimulated. There's just so much going on right now, that, my own foibles, I have to force myself to put down the phone and stop doom scrolling Twitter, which is not a healthy thing to do, but it's the kind of thing that you have to force yourself to do. But I certainly find the times to do that. My daughter dances, my son plays hockey. There's there are things that they're doing that I will engage with as well. But it is that different world where there just seems to be so much more coming at us, and figuring out the right way to balance all of these different things, I think, has become much more difficult. But I want to get Dan in here for his thoughts.
You see, I am skeptical of this crisis of masculinity sort of narrative.
Good.
And we see
I want to hear it.
We see
this.
I mean, we see this in a lot of places. There are editorials all of the time. And I'm not skeptical of it because I think that men aren't in crisis. I'm skeptical of it because if you look at, let's say, the beginning of the Iliad, Achilles' rage is sort of a crisis of masculinity. In fact, what is he? He's stripped of the woman he takes in battle by another man, is degraded and humiliated. And the rest of the narrative is playing out from that. If you look at Genesis 1-3, Adam's duties, what happens in the garden, all of that, failure to accept responsibility, that's a crisis of, you could frame that as a crisis of masculinity. If you look at the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, when Arjun despairs of the battle at Kurukshetra and says that he will not fight, and then Lord Krishna has to communicate both his dharma in the world and his sort of eternal dharma to him. This is a crisis of masculinity, and can be framed that. I never really thought in these categories growing up as a young man, and maybe that's because I had a normal childhood with a normal father and normal uncles and normal neighborhood friends and all of that stuff. And maybe that's a sort of luxury, but I went, was in Boy Scouts and the rest of it. Maybe that's a luxury. But when I was in college taking a critical theory class, and we're reading, Julia Kristeva and all of this feminist theory. And I'm in a used bookstore and I see a book on the shelf called The Man in Me, Visions of the Male Experience. And I'm like, oh, this is super interesting. So I pick it up. I do not recommend you read this book to children. There's a lot of it that's not child appropriate. There's a lot of it that's not adult appropriate, because it's all these sort of great male thinkers struggling through their maleness in profoundly different ways. There's an essay on, I'm not sure if it's a diary entry or if it was a fully developed short story of Kafka's, about being a bachelor his whole life and him eventually coming to the conclusion that he's not going to have a wife and he's not going to have children and he's not going to have a family, and renting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller rooms until he buys his own coffin. And it's is that a crisis in masculinity? It sounds like a crisis in masculinity to me. But, and this is where I think like all of these problems and the problems of gender relations in general are contextual. To bring us back to the man in me, Bob Dylan in The Man in Me opens how? With, "The man in me will do nearly any task, and as for compensation, there is little he would ask. It takes a woman like you to get through to the man in me." So there's a sense in which Dylan doesn't even know his own masculinity without not women writ large, not women in society, but this particular woman who brings out this particular man in him. And, there's a sense in which, I have masculine needs as, I'm recently engaged, for my fiance, yes. For my sister, yes. In relation to my mother, yes. These are not all the same, thank the Lord. And, they're contextually determined. And there's a world in which I am born and I don't have a sister and instead I have a brother. And that is a male-female relationship that I would never have. That doesn't make me less of a man to not have a sister, to not have a spouse, to not have... Because, as Whitman would say, men are large and contain multitudes. And I think we see that. We see these perennial crises. And I don't think there's anything really new about our challenges today other than the fact that we have disciplines like sociology in which to examine them and to take a look at these aggregates. And I think it's a mistake when you talk about, gender relations and these sorts of contextual embedded things in these sort of statistical aggregates. I think you get a distorted picture.
I also think you have to factor in the rise of and changes through feminism in the last 70 years as well. We've sort of depends on who you ask, whether we're in third or fourth wave feminism. And I love Christine Emba's book on this, Rethinking Sex, a Provocation. It's fantastic as you want to think about where feminism is right now, because obviously the two are moving in tandem. And, part of her thesis, which I think is so, well, I'll add my own part and then I'll get to hers, which is when feminism sort of first starts, there's not a whole lot to do except for mimic men. And you can see this in movies like Fatal Attraction's a great choice. The bad guy in Fatal Attraction is Glenn Close, who dresses like a man. She has kind of manly features and jawbone. And she's mimicking male behavior in a lot of ways. And obviously she's our villain who's boiling bunnies, and seen as sort of the anti-female. She is not feminine. But in some ways, that's like if you want to see this like a metaphor for feminism is boiling your bunny by acting like a man. So you're going to move through the pantsuits era of feminism and women trying to mimic male behavior in boardrooms or be like aggressive like men. And it's going to work to a limited extent. I mean, we as women owe a lot to those women who did that, because they're opening the door even a little bit for sort of that next wave of women to come in, which I would argue then is going to ask, well, wait, I don't want to act like a man. I'll never be as good at being a man as a man will be. Instead, I wonder whether I can use the feminine qualities that they don't have to actually beat them at their own game. And so you're going to see women dress in more feminine ways, and use their EQ, et cetera, to try to win in those settings. Now, Christine Emba's point is when it comes to sex, for instance, I don't know how much of a family podcast this is, so I'll try to keep it PG-13-ish. That women are still trying to mimic men, that they're told by society that the way to be a liberated woman is to have, purposeless, string-free sex. And of course, our brains are wired pretty differently. Men, and again, I'm going to keep saying this, not all men, but generally speaking, men can get a lot more out of pointless sex, one night stands, you don't know her name type sex, than women are going to be able to get out of that type of sex. And so then you have women in this age of sort of pornography and online dating and everything else struggling to find meaningful sexual relationships. And Christine Emba's point is maybe that's because women brains are actually more wired towards what she's going to describe herself as a love, not necessarily marriage level love before you can have sex. She's not for abstinence or anything like that, but a love in terms of wishing good toward the other. You can't do that if you don't know her name, if you just met him at a bar that night. But over time, if you're actually wishing good toward the other, both in a relationship setting or in a sexual setting, like that's going to have a much more satisfying sexual relationship. Why do I mention all this? Because again, feminism is evolving at the same time that I think masculinity isn't asking a lot of questions. It's almost just reacting to feminism. And so I think your point about there's, of course, always been masculinity crises. Yes. And they were talking about it and grappling with it, but in a context where it wasn't, there wasn't a feminist movement for Achilles to be acting in reaction to. And I think that might be part of the crisis right now, is that women have sort of been ahead of the game thinking through this and caring a lot more about it.
I'm curious for both of your reactions to this. How much of the problem do you think, and you mentioned social media earlier, Sarah, and my reaction to, I work in marketing, particularly digital marketing, and I did a lot of community building online, and I see both the benefits and the problems that come from those kinds of communities. They can be good if they're defined for one single purpose, but when people are looking for a broader sense of meaning and community, like you need actual flesh and blood human beings that there's the Dunbar's number problem really starts coming up when you're in a Facebook group with 50,000 people. You can't possibly know all of them, even if you share a single interest. I'm wondering how much of the problem is these crises of masculinity, as Dan detailed, have always existed, but it's complicated by the internet, as many things are complicated by the internet. And I think of, back at where I worked previously, I remember making an observation about, I hate using the term wokeness, but we will, again, for the point of people generally understanding what we're talking about there. That you had this kind of civic religion that was coming into being without forgiveness. And then a friend of mine added, but with perpetual atonement. And I think a lot of that is enforced by the internet nature of it, where if you have bad thoughts, we all have, things that cross our brain that we, aren't proud that we thought of. And you start writing that down a rabbit hole that is not a good idea. Or as even the example that I used at the time, say somebody says something that is, we can say racist or at least racially insensitive. If you did that amongst a group of friends that personally in a meaningful way, you can pull that person aside and you can say, hey, dude, that really wasn't cool. But when the communication is happening online, you get two different reactions simultaneously. You get one group of people that wants to excommunicate you from society forever as a result of it. And you get another group of people that say, no, you're right, continue down that road. So how much of this do you think is complicated, or at least the way that we're, defining this as being a new problem or a bigger problem than it traditionally has been, is because of that broadening and anonymizing nature of the internet that has changed some interpersonal relationships? If we are to believe that people are having a harder time, particularly men, making friends, finding semi-anonymous or anonymous people that share a similar interest with you online, that don't have your best interests in mind and can encourage you to be and do some terrible things.
They don't even know your interests.
They don't even know you. They only know what you tell them.
Yeah.
How much
can
of
you
this
add
is
in
just,
add in edgelording to that? Can and explain it to your listeners, I guess. But like edgelording to me is like some of this really baffling male behavior seems to happen obviously on the younger end of the male spectrum, but not entirely. So can you do some edgelording explanation?
Yeah, I would. You put me on the spot for a definition. I feel like I'm going to fail at giving it, but it's this online behavior that will embrace these really radical and provocative things. So, like, we've seen some of these stories. We talked about one of them 2 weeks ago, which was our last episode. Apologies to listeners that we weren't here last week. Of some of these conservative influencers, new right conservative influencers who talk about things like eugenics, or who make these memes that videos for political campaigns that involve Nazi symbology. It's these kinds of just crazy radical things. It's almost like, it is LARPing, I think, in a way, because I'm not persuaded at all that most of these people actually believe and or understand a whole lot of the things that they're doing. I think they're being provocative for the sake of being provocative, to draw a lot of attention, to annoy and piss off the right people. But it is entirely internet behavior. And it would be very bizarre to see it in the real world. I mean, like, anybody who doom scrolls Twitter, which you shouldn't do, sees those kinds of people who say things that are racist, awful, provocative for the purpose of doing it. But we don't see that in real life very often. And it's a lot of these moral panics, I think, are trying to chase down these people who misspoke or said something that was just a little bit off, and then trying to make it out as if they are the same kind of edgelord person that you see on the internet. I hope that was a sufficient explanation.
No, I think so. What I find fascinating from both sides of the woke edgelording spectrum, for the most part, the edgelord stories, at least that I'm hearing, are people who already felt rejected for some reason, men who already felt rejected for some reason, finding a tribe. And in that tribe, the language and the reward system is based on this edgelording, whether it's Nazism or whatever else they're edgelording about. And I'm not using that word right because I'm not a teenage boy. But there is something, of course, in your brain, like, let's say you do one thing wrong, or you're not popular, or the girls don't want to go out with you, whatever the thing is. And now you've got two choices. You can run into the arms of the people who have rejected you and try to get them to accept you. Or you can run into the arms of the people who say you did nothing wrong. That's what made me think of it from your previous comment. You did nothing wrong. Do more of that. You're the real hero of this story. Yes, most people run into the arms of those willing to embrace them, not those who are going to hit them and whack them. And we've seen that even with older, more well-known people. It can happen very slowly or very quickly. But like, they tweet something they shouldn't tweet. And instead of, in a previous non-social media era, you sort of like, I didn't mean that. That's not who I am. My bad. And maybe you spend a few months in the wilderness and like, it all works out. Now they end up just moving further and further and further into that group of people who are willing to embrace them. And I think we've moved on from pure masculinity stuff now, but it's a really bad and yet totally natural human reaction. If there's going to be these people who are like, no, keep doing it.
So I think the challenge with this is what we have is a world in which all of this is more visible to people who aren't in the thralls of it than before. It used to be you signed up for that gentleman's newsletter because you thought he had intriguing ideas, and it was delivered to you by the post office, and your neighbors didn't see you reading that crackpot newsletter. You read that crackpot newsletter in the comfort of your own home. You would occasionally let crackpot things slip out in conversation, but, people didn't see the degree to which you had bought into it. And
a lot of people couldn't even find the crackpot newsletter.
Yeah. And a lot of people wouldn't even know. And now, on the one hand, you have people that go down these sort of dark paths that Sarah's outlined. On the other hand, you have these people that are trying to elevate these dark paths to a position of prominence in which they should not be. And this is mainly, let's say, Andrew Tate is an excellent example. Andrew Tate is someone that really, it's even beyond the American press. News media got very interested in Andrew Tate all at the same time because he says these horrific, edgelordy, provocative things. And then all of a sudden we're talking about the crisis of masculinity in light of this YouTuber who at this point, I think that probably half of his views are people who are viewing his material to write profiles on how terrible Andrew Tate is. And you have this stuff that gets elevated. It's more visible than ever. Part of it is we have, civilization creates its own discontents. And we have these people, we have a duty to these people to reach out to these people, to express solidarity, to try to bring them back into the community and normal community norms. But these folks that reject those sort of norms, that proudly edgelord about it, are more visible than they ever have been before. I don't think this means necessarily that there are more of them than ever before, but the internet certainly amplifies them, and it also amplifies the people who are concerned about these things more. And it provokes ever shriller reactions. And you get this, I've talked about, this piece, The Internet of Beefs, numerous times on this podcast before. This is what social media is designed to do, is to amplify these contentious voices. And I don't think you get an accurate picture. Is there a lonely teenage boy out there who finds solace in the streamings of Andrew Tate? Yes. Is there a lonely teenage boy who watches a lot of Andrew Tate's stuff, jokes about it with his friends, but deep in his heart knows that this isn't really who he wants to be, but he's part of it. But, he's having fun. He's edgelording. Those people still exist. Those people absolutely exist too. But I don't think that we should extrapolate from that. And Sarah's talked about this crisis of masculinity in broader terms than this. And there are, labor force participation shifts, all these sorts of things, differences in marriage norms, marriage rates, these sorts of things. All of those, I think, are more serious conversations to have. But the idea that crackpots are finding an audience and that technology has in ways allowed them to leverage that in more ways than ever before. But, there's a non-zero number of crackpots, even in the good old days. You just found them at the crazy occult bookstore or, the local John Birch Society bookstore or all these other things that, don't exist anymore because of the internet, because all of that oxygen has been sucked up by that. And that's just a much more efficient means of transmitting ideas for both good and for ill.
Okay, but what happens? You're right. The edgelording thing is sort of its own little cul-de-sac to go down, and we've gone down it. We can return to the main road now. What happens then? I guess I want to divide the crisis of masculinity from sort of current older men, the opioid crisis, suicide rates, those problems, which I'm not dismissing them as being really important, but I think they're a different problem than the one about women's workforce participation, the 60% of college graduates, this wave that's coming, and we don't know what's going to happen because of that. How are we supposed to think about this generation of men, which you're right, some small percentage are edgelording, but the vast majority are out there doing the same they ever did. But we have all these statistics saying there's like really bad things on the horizon for them, or meaningless things on the horizon for them.
You see, I think, then you need, in the struggle against meaningless, meaning is always helpful. And, I come from, a religious tradition that says, that the kingdom of God is within you, and that you find meaning in service to others and service to God. And that is, a message that has never been universally popular. People try down cul-de-sacs to find meaning in all sorts of ways that, are, would take you further away from that. Some of those ways over the years have been more socially acceptable than others. There have always been both more socially acceptable and less socially acceptable versions of false meaning. And, I think, you can't, while we might be able to see the problem in aggregates, I don't think we can aggregate a solution. Meaning is something that comes to individuals in very individual ways through a myriad of means. So for some, it comes through spiritual teachers, through some, it comes through reading, through some, it comes in, participation in church, synagogue, mosque, all those sorts of things. For some people, it comes, like a thief in the night when they least expect it and in their least expectant ways. So I think, the idea that you're going to, let's say, restructure the economy in a certain way or raise certain tariff rates above this, and then, all of a sudden people are going to be able to get manufacturing jobs. By the way, if you look anywhere, there are high-paying manufacturing jobs available today, starting at excellent wages. We have a great labor market in America if you are looking for work. And I think that's indicative that, we've seen those shifts, very profound shifts in the labor market over the past couple of years, but it doesn't seem like it's about that. It doesn't seem, folks are having less and less sex. Like, we worry about these questions of, these material questions of like getting laid and getting paid, to be a little coarse about it. But the reality of it is these seem disconnected in some interesting ways from the data, between those things and meaning. And
I have a whole album side on my concern that the kids aren't having sex these days.
Yeah.
It's a really, really weird phenomenon that not enough people are talking about, because like, oh, well, there's less teen pregnancy, there's less abortion, so we don't need to worry about it. Like, no. They're not having sex because they've really thought it through and think that it'd be wiser to wait until later. They're not having sex because they're not interested.
I had done an interview with, and we'll put a link to this podcast episode in the show notes as well, with Yuval Levin. I think it was maybe about a year ago, because he'd written this really interesting piece, probably pinging off of the same information that you were just talking about there, Sarah, where we were looking at, basically he was giving the dark clouds to the silver linings, where you've got lower rates of teen pregnancy, you have a decline in the abortion rate, things that conservatives would celebrate as being good. But the dark cloud to it is it's not happening, as you said, because of some kind of rational thought, and to think that waiting until marriage is a better thing to do. It's because people aren't interested. I thought one of the more interesting and telling examples that he gave in there is, if you go back to the 1980s, what was the recreational drug of choice associated with the culture of the 1980s? It was cocaine, which is a drug. It's a stimulant. It's something that makes you want to go faster. It makes you more inclined to take risks. It makes you reckless. It makes you go out and do things. Now, look, I am not here saying that it was a good thing that people
Eric
were
is
abusing.
Pro-cocaine.
Yes,
that's
very pro.
That
is my role in this podcast. I'm the pro-cocaine person.
Yeah.
But at least what it showed there was this desire to get out there, to do more, to do it faster, even if it was reckless. And then you look into the 2000s and you see, what is the drug of choice? And it's opiates. And it's something that causes people to want to drop out of society, that doesn't make them want to go, that doesn't make them want to do things, that doesn't make them take risks, which is indicative of a problem. It is part of the problem itself, but it is an indication of, I think, the underlying inclinations of people, that they're not looking for something irresponsible to help them get out and do more. They're looking for something irresponsible to check them out of society. And this is where I think you come back to Dan's point about meeting, and that you have to kind of find these things on your own. You can't aggregate a solution to it. And to the extent that we were talking about the internet portion of it, and maybe this is a point where we can pivot to, because I think it actually can connect in some way to the other topic I wanted to talk about, is that we just haven't quite figured out, we forget how young the internet is, and we forget how young social media is, and we haven't quite figured out how to live with it yet. Because we are living our individual lives, and I can remember, in one of those internet age being Methuselah kind of things. Like, my first social media account was on Friendster. Like, I even predated MySpace, which seems like a long time ago, but that was like 2004. These things have not been around very long, and I think we're still figuring out how to live with them. And perhaps I seem just kind of doe-eyed and overly optimistic. I think we will figure out ways to live with them. It takes more time than especially an internet culture is allowing us, because because if I have a problem, like, I needed to fix the drawer of the chest of drawers in my daughter's room yesterday, and I'm able to Google a solution to that and watch a YouTube video, and I can get an answer to it instantaneously. And the problems that the internet, if it doesn't create, it exacerbates. We can't Google a solution to that. Like, we're not going to find the instantaneous solution online to the online problem. We're only going to figure out how to work through it and live with it over time, which is unsatisfying to people with, a limited lifespan. But when you think in terms of generations, in terms of millennia, yeah, we've always had these changes in society that we've just had to figure out how to live through over the course of time. And that's a not very satisfying answer to somebody with a limited lifespan. But from the point of view of a society or of civilization, it just kind of is the way that it is. Maybe we transition here real quick for the last few minutes of this show, because I want to bring up two very online things that caught my attention. In fact, I think, Sarah, one of them was your Was It Worth Your Time on the Dispatch podcast. These two new internet celebrities. One of them is this young man, Oliver Anthony, who had this very all of a sudden hit song called Rich Men North of Richmond, that became, we've had so many pixels already spilled on think pieces about this one song from this guy from, I think, was it North Carolina? And you also had this other episode that I thought was interesting, because it was one that everybody noticed, and everybody, I think, who is online at all participated in some way, which was this woman on an American Airlines flight who stormed off the plane saying that, won't use the language, but that person back there that she was sitting next to wasn't real. I've noticed over the last couple of days, we now know who she is. One, I just want to say that I don't like this in general. There's always this immediate desire to figure out who these people are. And I don't think that there's much of a purpose to all of that. Like, I'm hesitating to even say her name, because this is a person who we know of because of possibly her worst moment that happened in public. But because of the internet, and because everybody has a camera and a video recorder on their phone now, everybody's worst public moment can live forever, in a way that if you knew somebody who was on that plane and they told you, yeah, this woman got up and said some crazy stuff and then got off the plane, you probably wouldn't think about it again. But it becomes a meme and it lives forever. And what I found interesting is that, she now has a Twitter account, and she's a marketing executive, and it kind of looks like she's making a play for status and celebrity based on this incident. That I'm not so cynical as to suggest that I think she did it on purpose, but it's the kind of, do you just go ahead and do you take advantage of these kinds of things that happen to you? So I don't know that I have a question there, other than to say that I'm just kind of fascinated by this unintentional question mark internet celebrity culture. These people who, rather than going out like we were talking about before and seeking an audience, maybe these people were doing that, but they seem to have accidentally found an audience. And well, now they're some kind of a celebrity and they're going to deal with that and try to profit off of it, it seems.
On the one hand, nothing new about accidental celebrity culture, certainly. But on the other hand, the consequences are just so much larger now, I feel like, in a lot of ways, which is so weird because at the same time that these consequences can be so big for so few people, society, on the other hand, has really, and I mean American society here, has really tried to purge shame culture in any number of other ways. Everyone is supposed to sort of accept everyone for who they are, which has had some, I think, unintended consequences as well. If you can't have shame around anything, like what is society really doing here? How is it inculcating any of its values? And so instead, we pick out random people and put their heads on spikes. It's really, really weird. And as someone who works in communication, or used to, I compare it to all of these little rocks that hit our atmosphere every day. There's like millions of them, and most of them just burn up. But occasionally one, or bounce off, and occasionally one will make it through at the exact right angle that you have to, not burn up, and it hits the ground. And that's an asteroid. And like, that's what happens with this culture. It's not based on sort of any moral hazard. It's not based on the person did the thing the most wrong. I mean, like the woman on the airplane, she didn't do anything wrong. No one's accusing her of anything. And so she becomes a celebrity for no discernible reason. Maybe it's a slow news day. Maybe the tweet really hit someone as funny or whatever it was.
We can also, I think, draw it back to the masculinity problems too, because there's this weird internet culture of all kinds of men who seem to want to propose to her immediately, which again strikes me as just bizarre, but it was there.
Yeah. I think it's a very bad habit that we've learned from a lack of shame culture. I think the two are connected somehow. I haven't fully worked out how.
So there's another podcast. It's very different from Acton's podcast called The Legal Academy, in which the host interviews various people in law. And there's a great interview with Eric Posner in which Posner gets asked about what does he think about law students getting on social media and doing these sorts of things. And he basically says he thinks it's a terrible mistake. And he thinks it's because people genuinely hurt their reputations, and they don't realize they're doing it. There is a very distorting, there's sort of a reality distortion field in social media, and it's designed to do this. It's designed to make you, I think Posner uses the phrase that, it's designed to make you think the world is waiting for your thoughts. This woman who is trying to capitalize off of this weird thing, the reality of it is, I don't know if she was a marketing executive before or after, but the reality of it is in 6 months, people will hazily remember this thing. This is not something you make a career off of. You were an odd curiosity for the day. This gentleman who wrote this song, I still haven't heard this song. I've seen his picture because there have been 1,001 think pieces about this song. This is a guy who wrote a song. There are people who write songs every day. Many of them. There are more wonderful, amazing, life-transforming songs written than I will ever be able to hear, that I will love and the rest of it. And the idea that, you crest this wave and, you might be able to sell, a lot of downloads. Oh, and he's sold a staggering amount of downloads, not only of this particular song, but other songs in his catalog. The question is going to be 6 months later, will he have a career? I mean, he had a career before. He'll have some sort of career. But is this sort of the life-transforming sort of shot that one would get in a previous year by getting Egg McMahon to put you up on Star Search? Maybe. But there are a lot of people who got on Star Search back in the day who didn't break through. And I think this is ever increasing shortness. There are ever more people online. Only about half of India has smartphones now. The other half is going to get them in the next 40 years. And there will be another 500 million folks in India alone vying for viral videos. And you know what? Just like the lottery, some people win. But the logic that, in order to win, you've got to play is still a sort of terrible, insidious logic that, you see too many people buy into. They think that this is going to make a career. They think that this is important in some way, that the sort of regular workaday embedded work that you do at your job, in your community, with your family, that's where the dividends in life come from, and not through this sort of reality distortion field, even though it does transform certain people's lives, often for the worse.
Always reminded of that study, of the happiness study, or the hedonic treadmill study, however you want to think about it, of the lottery winners versus the accident victims. In 6 months, you return to where you were. So in some sense, it just doesn't matter if you win Star Search.
Ed McMahon, hardest hit.
Let's call it a wrap there. Thank you for listening to Act and Unwind. If you're listening to this podcast on our website, please look in the show notes for a link where you can subscribe directly to Act and Unwind, or just search Act and Unwind on your favorite podcast app. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, 5-star reviews only, so that more people can find our show. Thanks to Dan, and a special thanks to Sarah Isger. For the Acton Institute, I'm Eric Cohn. We'll see you next week.